The whole tragedy starts with the girl.
Prisoner 1970. That was my name. We were from East Slovakia.
The Slovak government made an agreement with the Germans that the Slovak Jews will be deported, provided that the deported will not come back.
We didn't know where we are going.
The girls were weeping.
At the time, the mascara was running down.
We arrived in Auschwitz, an empty place. And there, the girls began to die.
I am delighted to have a very, very special guest with us, the author of a book called 999, The Extraordinary Young Women of the First Official Jewish Transport to Auschwitz, Heather Dune Macadam. I got to tell you, first of all, thank you for being with us. I've spent my entire life reading about the Holocaust. As someone whose mother went to Auschwitz in 1944 with her family, and so much of what you described in the book, it brought back all these memories of the things my mother spoke about her arrival in Auschwitz and what that was like. Reading, your book, I got to tell you, it was painful, it was difficult, but everyone should read it. I think it's extremely, extremely important. So, let's get right into it. This incredible story about these young women. That's the incredible thing. We're talking about, girls, young women from the age of 16, 17, 18 and up, not married specifically, that the Slovakian government, told the families they are going to work for the next couple of months. They're going to have a job. Tell us the story. Let's start at the very, very beginning. These communities in Slovakia.
It's such an act of betrayal, that you trust your government to tell you, the Slovaks had already watched, the Slovak Jews had already watched so many of their rights be taken away. They weren't allowed to go to school. They weren't allowed to have a cat. They couldn't have fur coats in the winter, slowly the rights were taken away, as they had been taken away in Germany and Poland. But the Slovak government was actually fascist. And so their laws were even worse, which is hard to believe. And when they, when you want to get people to do something that they're not going to want to do, you got to lie. And so they lied. The government lied, and they said, your girls, between the ages of 16 and 32, anybody who's unmarried, young women, need to sign up for government work service. And at the time, Slovakia was the largest manufacturer of boots, army boots. It's a war. And so everybody even the police, the Slovak police thought, oh, they're going to go make boots, And I think the most shocking thing for me of this story, there's not even a word for what was done. They weren't sold into slavery. The government paid the Nazis to take them. It's like, at least, and this sounds very strange, but at least when you sell a slave or buy a slave, you value them because you have a monetary value on it, that individual, right? You paid them. So chances are you're not going to kill them right away. They didn't even have that respect of slavery, which is shocking to me. And then, they are excited. They don't know that the government's paid for them to go away, so they will never come back. They will never get married. They will never have children. They will be worked to death. But they're so excited because they're teenagers, and they think, oh, I'm going to have a job, and I'm going to go make money, and I'm going to send money home to my parents. And they sing the Slovak national anthem. on the way to work.
Amazing. Amazing. You know, as I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think of my own communities in New York, you know, communities that I represented for 36 years, and the young girls in the community just trying to imagine what it would be like, God forbid, that the impossible happens, the thing you just do not expect, you cannot imagine, actually happens. Can you describe a little more, because with regard to these young ladies, these were very innocent young women, from many of them from Orthodox backgrounds. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You know, just about everybody was Orthodox. I actually found one survivor in Australia who was raised, she didn't even know she was Jewish. She was raised in a Catholic home by her, I think her mother was Jewish and her father was Catholic. And she was on the first transport. It was actually her birthday. The day they were deported, March 25th, 1942, was her 16th birthday. And she didn't know anybody on the transport because she had been going to a private Catholic school. So she didn't even know what it meant to be Jewish. And the, you know, and then, so that's like one little, you know, notation of that kind of innocence. And the other is, you know, most of these girls had never gotten a kiss. You know, they are watched by their parents. Yora Amir, who we just lost last year, but he's one of my witnesses, and he was 14 years old when he watched his friends go on the transport. And one of his best friends was a girl called Magda Amster. And he describes how Magda's mother and his mother were best friends, and they used to bathe their daughter's hair in rainwater so it would be so soft and beautiful. You know, these were girls that were cherished, you know, deeply, deeply cherished by the family home, in the family home. And you know, parents you would never give your child up for something horrible. And yet parents, it was a law. So they did it willingly because they trusted the government.
Well, they trusted the government, and ultimately they had no choice, because anyone who did not turn over their daughter, those cruel, brutal guards, Slovakian guards, would come to the house, would come looking. I mean, they were meticulous. They didn't want to miss a single Jewish girl that was on the list. They had lists that they were following. Now, one of the first things you talk about is the again, it was very powerful, difficult to read. The first experience with the registration. We know they all ended up in Auschwitz eventually, but way before Auschwitz, they went to a particular place to register, thinking they were still coming home for the Sabbath. You know, they thought they were going to register, they'd be home for the Sabbath, and then they would go to work. The description in the book of these young women, these innocent young women, when they went to register, noticing these Slovakian guards, and they also noticed the SS there, wondering, what are the SS doing here? You know, the description of the women being told to undress completely. I mean, the terror, what that must have been like for any person to do it in front of others, in front of all their friends, in front of men. I mean, that I just had a hard time dealing with that.
You know, my husband, when I was writing the book, he's also a writer and he's my first editor. And he was reading that section, and, you know, and he said to me, you know, guys, you know, boys, teenagers, we're used to seeing each other naked. You know, we'll like, you know, go have a pee, and it's, you know, it's not, right. You know, we'll jump in the, you know, these girls, I mean, they're not even naked in front of each other. You know, they're right. Very super. And so to have this happen is just so jarring. And I actually, so Edith Grossman, who's my main narrative, a survivor who we just lost in July. She was 96 years old and an amazing, incredible memory and very very smart, super technical. She, her husband was a very famous Israeli author and Slovak author. And he wrote a book called The Bride, and it is about this transport. And it was a novel. And you know, he knew her story, and so he novelized that. And it was also turned into a film, not a very great film. It should be redone. But I used that scene, watching that film, and then saying to Edith, "Is this how it was?" And she goes, "Well, you know, no, we were naked," you know, and you can't really do that in a film in the 60s. And, you know, it was really extraordinary to imagine, you know, those moments. And of course, I mean, I'm going to leap forward. You know, this is my second Holocaust book, and my first Holocaust book, I worked with another woman who was on the first transport, and we worked together very closely. I've had amazing relationships with these women, and she told me everything, right? But she didn't tell me selections in Auschwitz were in the nude. She never mentioned that, and I didn't find out until I was writing this book, and I was like, whoa, how did I miss that? I didn't know to ask the question, for one thing. But you know, these women, you know, it's to be nude in front of a man brings shame. They're embarrassed, and so they didn't want to talk about it after liberation, you know, or they just pushed it away and made sure they didn't think about it ever again.
Part, you know, reading literally hundreds and hundreds of books in my life about the Holocaust, this part, the sexual part, the horrible things that went on, are only now beginning to be talked about, because, you know, who wants to talk about that? What Holocaust survivor over the years would want to describe the horror of what they went through in terms of sexually? You know, young girls, older people. I mean, you know, just thinking about it, there's no way we can, you know, when you read something like this, you automatically just picture and try to imagine. You know, we have sisters, we have daughters and granddaughters, and what that. And I got to tell you, you know, when I was reading the book, you know, I have a granddaughter who's 19 years old. You know, suddenly, you know, like, they come to your house, they knock on the door, and you're taken away, and the journey starts. And these young women who were so innocent, you know, in the very, very beginning, even after this registration, they're still not sure. They have no clue where they're going and what's going to happen to them. The 999. Tell us about, and it's so important for people to realize, you know, ultimately, from different towns in Slovakia, people end up on, not a train, a cattle car. I mean, just share with us, remind everyone what that was all about, what it was to be on a cattle car. I need to go to the bathroom. I need a drink.
But I want to touch first on that list, because the list is super important. When I first started this project, I didn't know there was a list anywhere. And so I was working with the USC Shoah Foundation simply to find testimonies from the first transport. And I compiled a list of 22 women. And then I had, I have a website, for my first book, renaspromise.com. And I put a form up there and say, if you know anybody from the first transport, please, or you are, please contact me. And so I started to get information. People started to contact me, and they would say my mother was, or my dad's sister was, and she didn't survive. And then they'd start to send me photographs. And so, you know, this book is a real multiple narrative of survivors and non-survivors. And you know, so we all know about this cattle car, right? Like, you know, we've seen Schindler's List, we know these movies, but the thing is that this is like the first one, right? Like, and they're all girls. And Linda Reich Brader, she remembers coming in, you know, getting, first of all, these are tiny, they're little women. There's no steps. They have to crawl in their dresses, right? And they're all dressed very nicely because they're going to work, right? So they're like, oh, I'm going to wear my best clothes.
Right. They're trying to be modest, and you describe how they're, you know, the tight skirts, and they're trying to, you know, it was difficult
to help each other. And then they get in, and there's 2 buckets. one for refuse, and one for water to drink. And this is they leave at 8:20 in the evening. I'll go back to Linda Brader. She describes the longest line of cars she's ever seen, and I've been on these train tracks in Poprad, Slovakia, and there's a really old track that's covered in grass, and I think that that's probably the track that they were on, and it goes around a corner, and these are slaughter cars, right? Like it says on the side of the car, 8 horses. And so, or cows. And so that's what these were used to transport, animals. And they're not warm. It's locked on the outside. There's a very tiny, it's just a ventilation window that they have to be lifted up to look out. And when they cross the border into Poland, Linda Brader remembers them lifting them up because she was a little tiny woman. They lift her up because she's tiny, and she says, "Girls, we're in Poland. We must be going to Germany through Poland." Right? There's just, and at that moment, the transport is passed into the hands of the SS. And this is the first official Jewish transport, which means it was ordered by the SS, by Himmler, SS Himmler. And as per the Wannsee Conference, which was just about 6 weeks earlier, and the final solution begins.
I got to tell you, Heather, the pictures in the book, and again, it's a book that everyone should get and everyone should read. The pictures of the young ladies, I got to tell you, as I'm reading, I found myself constantly going back to look at the faces of these young girls. And and I'm saying, God Almighty. Now they're on the train. It's winter. It's very, very, very cold. It's freezing. They're packed in, no food, some water. I try to comprehend, and we should all stop and do that, what it was like in a cattle car after car.
Some of these pictures. This is my memorial page. These are
it's amazing.
Survive, and this is Magduska Hartman, who has it is such a sad story because she was a caretaker to her mother, who had MS, and she said goodbye to her. She just thought she'd be back in a few hours. She just had to go, and they would be excuse her. And then this here is Adela Gross, and Adela was very good friends with Leah. This is Edith's sister, who did not survive, and Anna Hertzgovikova, and all 3 of these girls died. They all went to school together. This is Anu. Anu doesn't survive. She loved bread. She also went to school with the other girls. These are all like schoolmates, Wow. And I remember saying to Edith, so Edith knew Adela very well. And I said, do you know when Adela was selected? And she said, Heather, one day they were there and the next day they weren't. You couldn't see, you didn't know. You didn't see everybody because there were thousands of girls being selected to die. And so my first book, Rena, saw Adela be selected. And that was how I ended up in this book, because Adela's family found me, and they found me, and 70 years after Adela disappeared into the jaws of Auschwitz, they found out what happened to her because of the work I had done. And that was when I went, there are other stories out there, and who else can I help bring peace to? It's big work, because you disappear forever. And I really feel like it's important for us to pay tribute to these teenage girls who've been completely forgotten. They're a footnote. They're not even a footnote in history.
Right. Heather, very often, when I read this material, I sort of torture myself. It becomes very, very painful. And the question of, my wife says, why are you reading? Why are you another book? And the answer for me is, I want to, people who were murdered because they were Jews, people who were tortured for no reason except that they were Jews. I want to remember them. When I read your book, I became friends with the memory of these young girls who disappeared from the face of the earth, who disappeared from their homes, their families, and ultimately their families ended up in the same place. So they're on the cattle cars. They still have no idea. They're still hoping, they're on their way to work. Okay, some of them initially are enthusiastic about the idea of working because their families back in Slovakia didn't have jobs. They, whatever you were doing, you couldn't do it because you were a Jew, period. So they were hoping they could actually help their families. They'll send some money home for daddy and mommy back, and that's a good thing for many of them.
And the Magduska story, her family was sending things to them in Auschwitz. Did you, and there's a whole postcards that they sent back and forth. Did Magduska get the money we sent? We haven't heard from her, talking to a cousin, and thinking that they're like, oh, did you, have you seen her? Tell her to write us. Like they're in a camp, at a canteen and hanging, they have no clue. And those cards, those letters between the family are so heartrending.
As you point out, they had the girls write cards and they had dates on them. And some of those were sent back to their families in Slovakia
after
the daughters were dead. Yeah. After they were murdered, parents were getting cards that were done way before. Amazing.
And Magduska, the card that comes back, the cards start to get coded, and the card that finally arrives to the family is Magduska is fine, she's with Uncle Kaddish.
I got to tell you, Heather, as the book goes on and the girls get to Auschwitz, they arrive, and it's very vivid to me.
An empty place, and that's, for me, that's super important, because we tend to think of Auschwitz as the death gate going into Birkenau, which is that huge camp. That hadn't been built yet, right? The only prisoners in Auschwitz at this point, there are Russian POWs who are dwindling. 20,000 of them have been executed against the Geneva Convention. And there's Polish POWs. And some of them are intellectuals, POWs, intellectuals, anybody who's against, the Third Reich and the invasion of Poland. And so they come in, they're the first, they're the first women. And they're teenagers. They're terrified. One survivor tells me that the men were sort of catcalling. Not like modern day catcalling, but they're going, look, women, oh my God, they were so excited. And of course that terrified the girls, right? But these men hadn't seen a woman in, years, some of them, ever since 1938. Or 39, sorry. So it is, they come in, it's empty. It's the middle of nowhere. There's army barracks there, because this used to be where they kept the Polish army. And as they're coming in, they don't go through they see the Arbeit Frei, but they have to go in through a separate entrance. And as they are walking along, the provisional gas chamber, which isn't quite working yet, and it's quite small, they walk by it, and one of the women says to her friend, that must be the factory where we're working. They still think they're going to the factory to work.
Now, Heather, your description, the women arrive, by the way, they were all with suitcases, right? They were told they're going away for a while, so they actually bring suitcases, each and every one of them. Again, very, very powerful, the description, because you can see the horror, you can feel the horror of these women. When they arrive, and what they are put through in the very beginning, in terms of removing their clothing, and I want you to describe that. They're all dressed up with their finest in many cases, right? And all that changes very, very fast. They are dehumanized in a swiftly.
Very swiftly. The first thing that happens is they arrive and they, excuse me, they have to be counted. And one of the key things in the book is that there are 997 girls instead of 999. And Himmler was very heavily into the occult and astrology. And that number 999 is part of his magic, his belief in magic to end the Jewish race. Because 9 is the last single digit, and if you want to end something, you trine it. And I did this whole sort of section about this, and the so they keep recounting and recounting and recounting, and then they realize, oh, there's typos. So there's somebody scribbles on top of the list, which is quite thick. There's a in Yad Vashem there is the original list which we have filmed, and somebody writes retype in alphabetical order. So then there becomes another list. And so they finally are allowed to go into a block, which ends up being a block where they have executed Russian prisoners. So it's filthy. There's blood, there's dirty straw, there's bed bugs, there's, jumping on them. They start screaming, they can't get out. And that's really the moment where they realize, oh, this isn't what we thought. And the next morning, they are taken outside, they're counted again, and they start to line up and go to be processed. And the processing is typical Ravensbrück, which was the women's German prison camp, how they processed prisoners. And the first thing they do is they take everything. And even the Ravensbrück prisoners say, because there are female capos at that point, they say, in Ravensbrück, they take your stuff and then they give it back to you. But the Jews, we just took their stuff and we got it. The capos got it. So they lose any food, any nice clothes. They lose their underwear. I mean, they don't even let them have underwear, and they're naked. They are shaved. The first 100 girls are gynecologically examined, and in the midst of it, they start laughing. The doctor's laughing, going, oh, they don't hide, they're virgins, right? So they're not hiding anything up there, and they stop. And those first 100 women, that is, at the moment after that, they lose their hair. They're shaved like they're married women. So the depth of inhumanity that happens for these deeply, deeply religious girls to be violated and then have their heads shaved is beyond words. Then they have to get into a vat of disinfectant that burns their flesh. And then they are taken into a room where there are a bunch of Russian prisoner uniforms. And these are also filthy. They got bullet holes in them. There's blood, there's feces. The Russian prisoners are being executed right next to the block where the girls are held. And let's think about this. These, if you're tall in this group of women, you're 5'4". A lot of these girls are 4'8", 5 foot, and they're putting on Russian men's uniforms. So one of them says, I got a blouse that went down to my ankles. They put on pants and they can't, the pants are up past their chest and there's no belts. And then they are given slabs of wood with a, sort of like a Dr. Scholl without the the form-fitting shape of the wood. And those are their shoes, and they were made for men, so they're huge. And that's that they are completely, what's the word? They are all of their femininity is taken away from them.
Yeah. Well, they are dehumanized. That was the goal, to take away any value.
They, Edith has this wonderful, she said, they didn't want us to be women, and all of the girls lost their periods, and that was the moment where you stop being a woman, and so you lose that thing that makes you special, right? And she remembers Edith remembers when they were liberated, and that's over 3 years later she was liberated in May 1945, and she said the day she was liberated she got her period again, and
Wow.
she started to jump up and down and go, I'm a woman again. And that was her, and she told me that after the book came out. I was like, no, why didn't you tell me that before? It's such an amazing story. But you can't have your period when you're eating such a small amount of food, and they were fed less than 600 calories a day, I figured out, and doing hard labor. I mean, that's the other thing. They the work they do, they're demolitioning. These are teenage girls, they're demolitioning buildings.
Now, a lot of the book, of course, at this point, is about who survives and who does not survive. And one of the remarkable things, they got to Auschwitz, Birkenau, in 1942, and the idea that some of them survived to 1945 is absolutely, very few, but absolutely miraculous. I mean, how could you survive so many years in Auschwitz? Most people didn't last very long. You became weak, you became sick, you went straight to the gas chamber, plain and simple. Let's talk a little bit about that. What made one person survive and one person just couldn't make it, just couldn't live through the hell that they were living? I mean, that is a fascinating story. Now, I know one of the things that depended on what you were doing in the concentration camp, what kind of work you were assigned to. Let's talk about that in terms of who survived, who did not survive.
So your job was just key, the work that you did. Edith and her sister had they had a job that was later the punishment detail. And that it started out cleaning the lager, the roads of snow in their bare hands. They weren't given shovels, they weren't given brooms. And then they had to clean the ditches and the ponds. So they would be wet all day long, and they would get out and they would be wet all night long. And both of the girls get typhus. And there was a huge typhus epidemic started in July 1942, and even SS died of typhus. And so many young women died of typhus. And when the selections began in August of 1942 of prisoners, prior to that, they did not select prisoners. They would shoot them, they would, beat them, they would starve them, but they didn't, have them march up in front of SS and the left or the right. And, but that was one of the reasons the selections were done in the nude, so they could see the telltale signs of black spotted typhus. And you had any blemish and you could end up going to the gas. And then if you and then sometimes if you were too pretty, you went to the gas. I mean, it was a crapshoot. So
Heather, as you're speaking, again, we're talking about human beings doing this to other human beings, right? I mean, we're talking about men, women, Nazis, SS. It's incomprehensible. It really is. I mean, it's nothing new that what you and I are discussing. I mean, we've been living this. It's been a long time since the end of the war. But the inhumanity of man and women, what they are capable of doing, these innocent young women are destroyed physically, mentally, tortured in every single way. I still have such difficulty dealing with it.
It's hard. It's hard for me to understand, which means that it's even harder for students and young people to understand. This is my Bible. it's well used at this point, but it's the Auschwitz Chronicle, and it's the day-to-day records of the camp, and how many people died, how many people came in. And at one point when I was working on Rena's Promise, there was a selection of 20,000 women in camp. And I decided, and I knew that, a selection would start probably about 7 or 8 in the morning, and would go until the end of the day. So let's say it was 12 hours. And so we did the math. We did the math on how, and it turned out that it was 3 seconds. Your life was decided in 3 seconds by the, to step up in front of the SS and wait for them to decide. And I used to do this with my students. We used to do a mock selection. And at the end of it, I'd say, so how does that feel? Because I would go 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 1, and it's, you go, what? Like, that's fast. That's how quickly life was decided in Auschwitz.
Heather, every single morning, all these women, these prisoners, had to line up outside of the barracks to be counted every single morning. I don't remember what time it was. Was it 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock? They had to get up early because it was very important. And often or always in the nude, they would have to stand outside. Sometimes you mention in your book for hours and hours in the middle of the winter when it was snowing outside.
Yeah, that's the biggest selection of them all. And, one of the things that is that I became very aware of in the research of this book is that, so we have the SS records, but that large selection, which is, that is, 20,000 women, it's freezing cold. I have multiple testimonies witnessing that selection. And prisoners, male prisoners, Rudy Verba, who escaped from Auschwitz, he says it.
Right.
Edith, Linda, Rena, all of these disparate people who never knew each other in Auschwitz, if they survived that, and they took 10,000 women in one day, and they had to stand outside all day long in the snow. It was bitter cold, and be selected. And Edith and all of these, witnesses remember,
By the way, Heather,
to the block, and there's no
Heather. No scarves, no gloves, no winter coats, right? Nothing. Right? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The inhumanity, God Almighty.
The one thing that was the one thing the women of the first transports, because the first 4 transports to Auschwitz were all young women, and then on through into July, the one thing that probably helped them was the woolen Russian prisoners' clothes in the winter, not in the summer. Birkenau's super hot, but they weren't in Birkenau until August. And but yeah, it is unbelievable. It's but they're also quite hardy. If I asked Rena why she thinks she survived Auschwitz, she'd say, well, first of all, there's no reason, right? It's just luck. You just, I was really lucky. But she was also, she was a farm girl, right? So, they didn't have central heat. She was used to being, her body temperature was never, like mine. Like I would never make it, right? Because I like it 65 or 7. I don't want it 60 degrees in my house, right?
Right.
But they're, they grew up in a place that they had one fire, and that was for cooking. It wasn't for heating the house. So, that makes a big difference. City girls had it much, much worse, right? So the girls, when the transports start coming in from Holland, in around August 1942, they drop like flies because you don't have the muscle strength. You haven't been trained. Your body's not used to this sort of rigorous.
Yeah. You pointed out that the girls that were thinner to start with did better, lasted longer than those who were, well-fed, you may say. It's fascinating what you're saying, about, if you were used to 3 meals a day and sumptuous meals at home, and now you suddenly find yourself in this environment where you're not getting anything. You literally are not being fed a little piece of bread, if you want to call it bread. some kind of mixture of some kind of soup that God only knows what it was. They had no choice. Nobody would have eaten that soup any day of the year back home. They, under no circumstances, but here they had absolutely no choice. By the way, there was a hospital, right, and a Jewish doctor who, you could go to the infirmary. Tell us about that infirmary doctor.
Yeah, well, but quickly, the soup, and there's one of my favorite testimonies by Margie Becker. She says that it was smelled so bad she had to hold her nose to drink it, or she had her friends hold her nose to drink it. And of course, it wasn't kosher. So many of the first girls, when they arrived, they were like, "Oh, I'm not going to have this," and then, of course, they had no choice. But yeah, so there is. In any story of the Holocaust, and I think it's really important we remember that despite all these horrors and the horrible people, the reason they're survivors is because of wonderful people and people who risk their lives every single day to help each other. Right. And so Dr. Mansi Shlobova is, she was a Jewish, she was not quite a doctor yet because she was Jewish, so she didn't get to finish her training, but she, she is one of those amazing women who, she saves Edith's life. She saves many, many young women's lives. And Edith ends up with tuberculosis. After Edith's sister dies, Edith gets bone tuberculosis, and Mansi Shlobova knows her. And so she sneaks her into the hospital and then and takes care of her. And then she comes to her one night and says, "You have to leave now and go back to work. I'll come get you after," because there's going to be a selection. And so, Mansi, any girl that was had the health to make it back into the work, she would sneak them out, and then they would come through and take all the girls that were too ill to the gas, and then she would let Edith come back and recover. So she did that for a couple of months, and one of the testimonies. They do a surprise selection in the hospital, and one of the young women is there recovering from typhus, and Mansi Shlobova comes and makes her get in the laundry bin, and she waits until Mengele passes, and then she gets out of the laundry.
I mean, that's part of the amazing story, is in spite of, in one moment, you could just be taken away. A split second, you went to the gas chamber. There was no second thoughts on the part of the SS. Your life was over and finished. But nonetheless, so many situations where people try to help each other in whatever way, which ended up actually saving the lives of certain people. It's an amazing story.
To go back to Mansi Shlobova, so on the death march, it didn't matter if you'd had a good job or not. The death march was the death march, and people died right and left, and Mansi slips on the ice and falls, which is enough reason to be shot. And Edith and her friend Elsie, grab her and pull her up. So what goes around comes around, and they are able to save Mansi's life. So I sort of I always cling to those stories, and I it's sort of what keeps me going, in terms of this work, because we have to remember that humanity does have great good and courage, and if we take care of each other, we can survive almost anything, even if you lose those you love.
It's incredible. The war is pretty much over in 1945. The Germans, the Nazis, they know it's over. It's just a question of time. And nonetheless, until the very last moment, pretty much, murdering Jews, killing Jews is the goal. You got to continue. You can't, you got to the very last one. So some people are left in Auschwitz, but as you described, the death march, which my mother described that in her situation, where she was in one of those marches. And at one point, Heather, she describes, they were all lined up with the SS in front of them, and my mother closed her eyes, and the others, they thought they were dead. They thought they were going to be machine gunned. And she opens her eyes, and they disappeared. I mean, so the war's over. You know, leave. You've done enough destruction. You've created enough horror. But no, they take the Jews out of Auschwitz and other concentration camps and march them. And as you pointed out, people die, you know, as they're marching on the road, on the side of the road. If you couldn't keep up, you were shot on the spot, dead. Just unbelievable. So, you know, for you talking to these survivors, it must have been a remarkable experience, and very difficult for them, I assume, to remember the horrors of so many years ago. What do you think prompted them to share the horrors of the past?
Every single one of them feels strongly that the reason she survived is to tell the story, and to make sure that people know, so that they will treat each other better. You know, I mean, Edith talks about, war is the worst thing that can happen to humanity. There's just nothing worse than war, and nobody wins. And so why should we even have a war? Why, this is it. And my Rena Kornreich Gellison, who was in Connecticut, she was quite ill when we had 9/11, and I went up to see her that weekend to see how she was, because she, it was very scary, especially for survivors. And I went up to see her, and I said, "How are you?" And she said, "I'm worried." And I said, Yeah, I know. I'm worried too. She says, what will happen to the Muslim Americans? Will they treat them like the Jews? And I went, like, that's my survivor, right? Mm-hmm. Her heart was so big. She, it was about being kind to everybody. And she fell in love with a Gentile. That to me is the message for all of us, is that we must absolutely love we're all human beings. That's it, first and foremost. Doesn't matter what you believe. We're in this together. And yeah. I think COVID is the great leveler here. COVID's not running around going, "Oh, well, I'm not going to pick you."
Right.
No, we are together, and we have to help each other.
Look, it's a great goal, but I'm not sure that things are getting better in the world that we live in. As I know, that anti-Semitism all over the world is not a good situation. The numbers are higher than ever, whether it's in Germany today or France, England, and the United States included. Hatred of Jews is alive.
Yeah, it's just I can't tell you. The very first lecture I ever did, and it was in North Carolina, and it was back in the 90s, and a bunch of skinheads walked into the lecture, and 800 people were there. And everybody turned and looked at them, and they turned and walked out. And I went, "Oh, well, there you go. We got our work cut out for us," because you have to educate people. It has to be through education. And you can't, brainwashing, pointing to saying that's the other, targeting, looking for, a scapegoat. All of that is, it's, I think the human nature I think we sort of, we lean towards it, but it's not logical, and it's not healthy.
Absolutely not. Heather, I want to thank you and urge everyone, the book is 999. It's extraordinary. If you've read 100 books, make this 101. I mean, it's really worth reading. It's really important that we continue to absorb and learn and read. what happened, what man was capable of doing to others. Very, very important, especially right now in the world that we live in. So Heather, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And
The paperback is coming out next week too, so you can even save money.
oh, good. Oh, right. That's coming out. Very good.
Thank you so
also,
much.
the documentary, which I watched, is something that's very important. Is that something already available, the first part, or what's the story with that?
Do some events. We're fundraising for the documentary. We do some events and show part one. And so if anybody has a synagogue or a community center that they would like to do a Zoom event, we're happy to do that. I do a presentation and show part one, which is about 20 minutes.
How do they get in touch with you?
Oh yeah, you can find me at 999themovie.com or 999thebook.com. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I watched the documentary, and having read the book was so important. And it's tough for me to go through this again and again. But you know what? It's the least that we can do in the memory of the 6 million. The least we can do is to read about the victims at the very least. So Heather, thank you so much, and look forward to continuing to have a dialogue with you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we were able to talk.
Absolutely, Heather. Thank you.
The whole tragedy starts with the girls.
Prisoner 1970. That was my name. We were from East Slovakia.
The Slovak government made an agreement with the Germans that the Slovak Jews will be deported, provided that the deported will not come back.
We didn't know where we are going.
The girls were weeping.
They were crying. Their mascara was running down.
We arrived in Auschwitz, an empty place, and there the girls were going to die.
Not anyone can survive at that place for that long.
The guilt of the survivors will never let you go.
My mother did not want to talk about it.
She used to scream that people are coming to murder her.
You have no idea what it happened here. Oh my God, how could I survive this?
It's a kind of a closure to be here.
This whole journey has been enlightening and frightening.
There's proof that they existed. Yeah, I've got my mother's word, but this is in black and white.
I hope that people realize how horrific this was.
I would do anything to have the girls remembered.
Why did we stay alive? To go and to tell. That's the mission of the survivors.